Hello, everyone, and it is Eric and Carrie, and we are back for video 2 of this Keynote experience. If you jumped in and are watching video 2 without watching video 1, you can do whatever you want, of course, this is for you, but it might make sense to go ahead and pause this video, go back and watch the first pre-work video, and just to give you some context in case you are jumping in here. We have 3 pre-work videos that are leading us up between April 10th and April 17th to this just-in-time dynamic keynote that we will be giving from noon to 1 on April 17th. And so we have built these 3 videos that we're hoping you will watch, and you're watching one right now. Use the comment area on the YouTube video to add your ideas, your questions, your concerns. And then Carrie and I will take a look at all of those comments and use that as information to help us decide what you want from us in our keynote that we'll be doing on April 17th. And so this is pre-work video 2. Our main aim in this video is to really focus on the current situation we're in. This COVID-19 situation, which has forced all of us as educators to make moves in the middle of the semester. Many of us have moved our face-to-face courses online. We're in the process of doing that often day by day. And our proposal for you in this video is that the active learning framework, the active learning paradigm is the right go-to answer for the immediate crisis management needs we have as teachers in this moment. And Carrie, you are muted. And so I will just remind everyone, we are struggling from home, and our last video had a little bit of background noise, and so we're going to try to mute ourselves in between when we're not talking. We're keeping it real. We're going to try to make the audio quality a little bit better, but that might mean we need to prompt each other. And so Carrie, you're muted, and you should unmute yourself and help us out here.
Thanks for letting me know that, Eric. So yeah, you've seen this slide. This was in part 1. Eric and I talked about active learning being more than just sprinkling in some activities to a class, but really being an entirely new paradigm, kind of a different framework or way to be thinking about your teaching, the different way to think about yourself, your students, and what it is that you're actually focusing on. We already reviewed all these different elements. And for part 2, we're really going to ask you to hone in with us on this top row that is focused on teachers making the shift from being experts, content conveyors, into the role of being course designers and learning facilitators. We know, as Eric already mentioned, that you are struggling right now, a lot of you, to think about how to give your students the best learning experience when you're not there in front of them. How is it that you're going to design a course experience for them for whatever remains in this semester so that they can learn, and how are you going to facilitate that? So in some ways, this crisis has forced a lot of us out of our typical norms, our comfortable position, doing whatever it was that we did with the tools that we knew how to use. We've had to learn very quickly to do things differently. Similarly, when Eric and I bring our colleagues through our Active Learning Institute, we talk a lot about this transition and how important it is. In the old paradigm, you were the person who was covering information for students, making sure that you explained it clearly, that they got all the information, and then somehow they were responsible for learning it and absorbing it and knowing whatever it was that you wanted them to know. That is not the case for the active learning teacher, the course designer, the learning facilitator. This person is not focused so much on what information they convey to students, but how are they going to design a course that really facilitates real learning using those ingredients that we talked about in part 1 for learning. And so what does that look like? How is that different from being the teacher, being the stage on the stage? Now is an ideal time for you to be making this move because we are already all dealing with a lot of discomfort. You have already been asked to upend whatever it is that you normally do. And so it makes a lot of sense to be thinking about making the shift in the direction that the research supports. If we're already uncomfortable, why not work in the direction of making our classes better, of helping our students succeed more. And so what can we do in this top row as teachers to step into this role of being more like course designers and learning facilitators? The first thing that you can do, the very first move that you can make, and maybe some of you have already made this move, and if you haven't, we would suggest that you start thinking about it, is to really start focusing on essentials. It may be the case that somebody told you for the last few weeks of the semester, you should really focus in on essentials. Your class is not going to be as rich or as dense as it was in whatever format you were running it before if you're making all of these changes to the modality, to remote teaching and learning. And so you really need to focus on the essentials. And what does that mean? That means what matters most. What are the things left in your course that you most want students to be able to do when they leave at the end of the semester? What matters most? You're going to have to make some hard choices. Well, when Eric and I are teaching our colleagues and working with our colleagues on this very first important step, we talk about this as learning outcomes. We let people know that they really need to get clear on what it is that they want students to be able to do at the end of the semester. And outcomes are very different from content. Content is that stuff that we want students to learn. Outcomes are those things that we want students to be able to do in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years down the road. We know from the science of learning that most of the stuff, the facts, the content that students learn in your class, whether they learn it in their short-term memory just to kind of do well on a test, or whether they pack it into their long-term memory, but only keep it during that semester because it's going to get pushed further and further back, they're not going to be able to retrieve most of that information and apply it in the future. We just know the research on the science of learning and our own experience tells us that most of that information we learn in our undergraduate courses, it goes away. And so the idea that we would spend these precious few weeks that we have left with students packing in content and trying to get them to cram all of this information in that we know they're not really going to move into their long-term memory in a meaningful way when taught this way is probably not the best use of our time. So we ask you to think about what are the essentials, what are the things that students really need to take away from your class, and how can you focus on those? I'll just back up before we do this reflect and writing task to say that a lot of you have probably never been given the opportunity to think about the essentials before or the outcomes. When a lot of us start teaching, we are handed a template or some requirements or a syllabus or an entire curriculum to teach from. And so for me, when I stepped into my role as English faculty, I was pretty much told, here are the 5 essays that we tend to teach at this college, and you're going to teach these 5 essays. And so go ahead and build your course around those things. For a lot of people that are in content-heavy disciplines, they're handed a book or a list of topics. And so naturally, we start to plan our courses around content and what kind of content we need to cover, rather than asking, what are the essential skills that students need? What are the most important things that students need to be able to do at the end of the semester? What are our learning outcomes? You may have already been asking yourself that as you're making choices about what to leave out of your class for the rest of the semester and what you absolutely need to make sure that they're doing. What are those most important things? And so we want to give you the opportunity right now to go ahead and pause and to spend some time answering this question, either for yourself on a scrap piece of paper, or you can go ahead and post it in the chat.
Carrie, I'll just add, if someone wants to reflect on this, was it difficult to decide what to keep and what to get rid of if you had to make these hard choices? I just know I had to do this with my face-to-face class. I had to move it online, and I couldn't keep doing the things I had planned. I couldn't do all of them, and I had to grapple with, what do I actually need to help my students accomplish in this last 5 weeks of the semester? And so you can also reflect on that. What was this process like when you actually grappled with what are the essentials? And so please do write on paper, share out to the comment section on the YouTube video. What was this process like of narrowing down the essentials? And so we'll ask you to pause and then start the video up after you've stopped and done some writing on that. So the beginning of, as Carrie mentioned, it is your class as the teacher. You are the one who gets to decide what the students do. I mean, clearly, if I were to scroll back up to the active learning paradigm, the teacher can decide what kind of design to have, and the students then will come along with you. So when Carrie said, it's really on you, the teacher, we're going to focus on what it means to move from being a sage on the stage to a course designer and learner facilitator. If you decide to change your course and to design it in a different way, you're automatically going to be building in then change from where the students used to be to where they are now. And then the third row on our active learning paradigm shift chart really talks about moving from, as Carrie mentioned, content to outcomes, to think about what is it that the students need to learn, what do they need to be able to do. Once you've identified those essentials or those outcomes, the next step in the process is to really think about how do you actually assess the extent to which students met those learning outcomes. Did they become proficient at those outcomes? Did they master those outcomes? And that is what we're calling a summative assessment. That might be an exam, it might be a project, it might be a paper. You have summative assessments in your class now. You're probably thinking about those as your ability to use this assessment to judge the students' learning, to grade the students on how much they learned. As active learning facilitators, and Carrie and I are really members of the new paradigm, we really like to think about summative assessments as places in your course where you give students an opportunity to showcase what they've learned. And of course, students showcasing what they've learned and you assessing what they've learned, we're really talking about the same thing. But when we think about outcomes that students practice and work toward, then the summative assessment is their chance to really show themselves and show you what they've learned so you can see what they've learned and figure out where to go from there. And so this is really the first step in what we're going to call an active learning backwards design. Decide what your essentials are, what you absolutely need to do or your students need to do, and then to design a summative assessment that actually captures and lets students showcase what they've learned. And so, again, you're probably in this process of redesigning your class on the fly. If you're not, you know your colleagues are. If you're an instructional designer or if you're an educational leader, you know that that is what everyone's working on right now. And so I guess we would like to give you a chance to kind of think about this process that either you've gone through or you're going through, or you've seen your colleagues or you're watching them on their Facebook post talking about this. As you've narrowed down maybe and thought about the essentials in this semester, what you can actually accomplish with your students in this new course that you're designing on the fly, have you had to modify your summative assessments? Have your colleagues had to modify their summative assessments based on the current situation we're in? We would love you to stop and pause and write about that. You can write on a piece of paper. We would really love it if you would actually use the comment section on the YouTube to actually talk a little bit about this. What was it like? You can talk about what the summative assessment you used to do was, why it got modified. Most likely it was modified because you had to change or reframe the learning outcomes because you couldn't accomplish everything that you would have been able to in your typical face-to-face class that you were running. And so feel free, actually do it. We're going to ask this as a challenge. Pause the video, think, write, reflect, and when you're done, go ahead and hit play again. So Carrie and I thought we'd tell you a little bit about our experience with this. So if you watched video one, you got to hear us talk about our best class ever. We had both been teaching for a long time. We had both been teaching together in a learning community for a long time. But as Carrie mentioned, before we took our learning community online, we still were basically running two independent classes that just happened to have the same cohort of students. And I sat in on Carrie's class and she sat in on my class, and we might have chimed in once in a while, but Carrie still ran her English class the same way with the 5 essays. And I was still running my ethics class with ethics homework and quizzes and ethics exams. And this is really before we sat down and had that extremely difficult summer. We had the luxury of a whole summer to sit there and redesign our classes. We know that in this crisis, you have not had that luxury. But we do think that we went through a similar process. We just had maybe more time and space to think about it. But before our outcomes based design, we really didn't have to think about the essentials. We could just kind of do what we wanted to. When we combined our classes, we had to negotiate every single thing. We had to negotiate not only what the summative assessments would be, because we decided we need one set of summative assessments. I had to get rid of my exams. I had to get rid of my quizzes, and I had to get rid of most of my homework because they were just about ethics. And Carrie couldn't keep her same homework and her same English papers because those weren't about ethics. We had to merge everything together. And so we had to actually think about what's essential. I couldn't keep everything. Carrie couldn't keep everything. We had this back and forth. You're doing it with yourself. But we moved from this standard English paper, a standard ethics class, after this active learning redesign in our online learning community. We ended up designing something that our essay number 3 is now called Letter to Jake. And I know this slide has a lot of information on it. Feel free if you want to pause the YouTube video and zoom in a little bit, or as Carrie mentioned, if you want to see any of these documents, we would be happy to share. But this is really just to illustrate how once you've identified the essentials, the outcomes, what really matters in your course, how that can drive the development and the design of a meaningful summative assessment. And so, again, you can't read all these probably, but these are all the things that we both decided in ethics and in writing were the core learning outcomes, the essentials that students needed to get. And they are simply both English and ethics outcomes that we needed. And instead of doing, I'll say, a typical, I'll say boring 5-paragraph essay, and I know Carrie didn't assign 5-paragraph essays, we really had to come up with something a little bit unique. It is still an essay, but it is an essay specifically designed to allow students to showcase what they've learned in ethics and in writing in one place. And it is this ethics guru letter to Jake. And so we have been through this. We know you're going through it. We do know that it is not easy.
So at this point, we hope that you've had an opportunity to think a little bit about your own teaching and those essentials, those things that you think are really most important for your students to get. And then we hope you've spent a little bit of time thinking about the assessments that you've traditionally used, whether or not those assessments have had to change due to this new situation that we're in. And since you're already thinking along those lines, we would encourage you to just be willing to break the mold a little bit and think about what those assessments could be. Maybe you've traditionally used 5 exams in your class. Does it have to be that way? Do the exams really help your students get at those things that you think are most important, that are most essential in the course? If not, this time of uncertainty and change may be a really good opportunity for you to think about, what could I do that's different, okay? So once you've gotten clear on your essentials or your outcomes, and also the summative assessment that you will use and have students work toward, you really have to start thinking about the backwards design. What do the day-to-day or week-to-week elements of the class look like? And these should be the activities that students are engaged in as they're attempting to gain the skills that will allow them to demonstrate proficiency or mastery on those summative assessments. Here's our favorite mentor. His name is Dr. Terry Doyle. Maybe you've read some of his books. They're excellent. He says the person who does the work does the learning. That is our new mantra ever since we read Doyle, probably 7 or 8 years ago. We have taken this and shared to heart and shared this quote with many people. As you're planning day to day, you really need to be thinking about this very important aspect of learning. We cannot do the work for our students. We can stand at the front of the class and give a really enthusiastic, heartfelt lecture. We can do the same thing through a video recording like this, but it's the person who does the work that does the learning. And if we're doing all of that hard work, our students aren't doing any learning. So think about that when you're designing day-to-day things for your students to do online.
So, Carrie, before you move on, I just want to zoom out and let people behind the curtain. I mean, we're asking you, our audience, to engage with the comments on this YouTube video. I won't tell you how many hours Carrie and I have spent over the last 2 weeks doing the work to develop this PowerPoint. A lot. And we have learned a lot by building this. We know that if you're actually going to learn something from this pre-work, you need to engage and do some work. And so when we ask you to stop and think and write, we really mean it, because we know the extent to which you're actually thinking and struggling and working and writing and reading other people's comments and replying to their comments. We're engaging you in doing work that will actually allow some of this content that we are transmitting to you via this video to sink in. And so, in that transmission of knowledge paradigm, as Carrie mentioned, as the teacher, you were doing a lot of the work, if not most of the work in the class. And so, this active learning paradigm is asking you to shift that. You're still going to be doing a lot of work as a designer, but the goal is to design a class where the student is doing most of the work, because that's the person who you want to actually do most of the learning.
Okay, so digging into that point a little bit further, as we're thinking about backwards designing with active learning in mind, the questions and the order in which you should think about these questions are: what are the skills and knowledge that students are going to need in order to be successful on this summative assessment? And this requires you to take a hard look at your summative assessment. What am I actually asking students to do? Sometimes we fool ourselves into thinking that if we give students all the content, they can perform well on the summative assessment. But then the summative assessment is actually asking students to do far more than regurgitate content. Sometimes there are really high-level cognitive skills involved on the summative assessment. So this would be an example of this would be a class that is mostly dumping content on students, but then may incorporate essay exam questions where students are asked to not only recall content, but synthesize that content, analyze, synthesize that content, create a thesis or an overall point, and then maybe develop that content into a mini argument or a mini essay. Those are totally separate skills from being able to recall content. And so when you look at the summative assessments you're using, you really need to ask yourself, what are the skills that students need in order to succeed on this summative assessment? Am I teaching those skills? Am I designing my course to give students opportunities to practice those skills? So that brings us to the second box here. Whatever those are, you need to design opportunities, regular, low stakes, formative opportunities for students to practice those skills and develop that knowledge. That is your job as a course designer. It's not to convey the information, it's to design opportunities, activities, quizzes, discussions, guided thinking activities where students can go in and practice using that content in meaningful ways that gear them up to be successful on the summative assessment. What is your role then? If you're no longer the one who's doing the heavy lifting, making the 3-hour lectures, standing at the front of the room, giving your enthusiastic speech to students, then your role becomes that of a learner facilitator. You are there to watch students during their learning. And you can do that in a face-to-face class as they're working on a guided thinking activity and you're walking around looking. But we have so many great technological tools in D2L. You can watch your students doing their work online as well. As they're developing their discussion posts, as they're doing guided thinking activities that you may have built in the quiz area, that is where you step in as the expert, because you still are the expert. You still have all the content knowledge and you know where students need to go in terms of those outcomes. So your job, in addition to being the designer of those experiences, is to step in and offer just-in-time feedback for students. That correction, that feedback that we talked about earlier as being two really important ingredients for learning, so that they can adjust their thinking, adjust their approach to how they're doing something, so that they can move in the direction of meeting those outcomes.
So you've seen we pared down the ingredients for learning. I just wanted to reiterate what Carrie said. The whole point of an active learning design is to design a course where students do the work and do the learning. And so your job in the day-to-day design is to design in the practice intentionally to decide what skills do students need to practice? How do I provide, we really call it, how do I design opportunities or experiences for students where they get a chance to take risks in a low stakes environment? Because we know learning, and you will recall from video number 1, whatever it is that you got good at took time, you made a lot of errors, you had to take risks. If you're afraid of making mistakes, you're probably not going to learn very much. And so an active learning course is really built around practice, trial and error in low stakes environments where students are practicing skills. And as the teacher of the course, you're there watching, giving them feedback in the moment. And I'll just zoom out for a minute. If you're recording your lectures right now and you're making your face-to-face students, maybe you're spending hours and hours recording your lectures that you would have given live to your students. Well, now those videos are recorded. You're still giving them the content. Well, what's your new role now as a teacher? You don't have to give that lecture. You've got it recorded. You can just have students watch it next semester too. You now have really, as Carrie mentioned, you have an opportunity to reframe who you are as a teacher, and all those hours that you were typically spending standing in front of class giving the lecture, you can reallocate your expertise to giving feedback and watching students do the work. I mean, that's what it means to be a learning facilitator, to be in there intervening in that moment when students are learning, to give them meaningful feedback, timely feedback. And so we just wanted to tie these pieces together. You want your students to do the work. Your job is to design a class where you've decided on the outcomes, where you have decided on the outcomes, where you have built the practice and you're giving them feedback and you're setting them up to be able to succeed when they showcase what they've learned on those summative assessments. We thought we would talk just a little bit about some of the things that we did in our online class. These are probably fairly typical. We know lots of our audience out there. A lot of you are online teachers. A lot of you are online teachers now, even though you weren't online teachers 2 weeks ago. But some of the things that Carrie and I have designed into our online learning community class, and I will say now that I'm teaching face-to-face, I use these same online components that were originally designed for an online class. I actually use them for my face-to-face class as well. One thing that we really love is using the quiz tool. Carrie mentioned Desire to Learn, D2L. That's the learning management system that Front Range Community College and the community college system in Colorado uses. These will work regardless of what learning management system you use. Every LMS has a quiz tool. Every LMS has a discussion tool. And so these tools actually are super robust and they have tons of uses. One thing that we do is we use the quiz tool to design what we call guided thinking activities. Now, Carrie mentioned that in a face-to-face class, many of us do this all the time. You put students in small groups, you have them working, you're walking around facilitating that work. The students doing the work, you're facilitating, giving them feedback. You can do that in a quiz as well. And you can see this is an example from our class. This was in week 11. We need our students to learn how to do library database research. It's an online class. We can't physically take them to the library. We can't invite a librarian to come into our class and give a lecture to our students. So what did we do? We designed a quiz, quote unquote. It's a guided thinking activity. And you'll see here, this is the first quiz question. The question itself has an embedded video, which is really a lecture that Carrie gives that's about 12 minutes long, where she's actually helping students learn about research. They watch this video. in the quiz tool, and then they're going to use the answer box to answer some questions. And then they're going to go to question 2, and they're going to watch another short video or read a prompt, and they're going to do something with that. This is probably going to take students an hour, maybe an hour and a half. It's independent work. Students are doing the work. So what do we do in the back end? Well, then we get to go and look at the work students do and give them feedback. And we can intervene. If they didn't succeed in finding a database, then we can figure out in this low stakes environment what we need to do to help them. And Carrie, you can check me on this if I'm wrong, but I will say what I think is true is our students do better research and have more success accessing library databases through the intervention of this guided thinking activity than they actually did when we ran this live. And this is an extremely effective way to get students to do the work.
I would agree. We used to, as did all English teachers, we used to take our students physically over to the campus library, and we would have a librarian teach them how to use the databases, but then they were released to go home and figure it out. And by the time they got home, they usually forgot. And it was either because they weren't paying attention the first time, so they never really learned it, or they got distracted and they can't access that information that the librarian gave them, and so they forgot it all. And so I would generally get lots of emails and confused students over the next week while they were doing this research. In this very carefully designed guided thinking activity, there are, these are set up as questions. You can see that there's 4 questions, but really they're prompts. And I prompt students with short videos where I give them a little bit of information, just enough for them to handle, like 10 to 12 minutes. And then they're asked to think about, reflect on, do something with that information. At one point in the guided activity, I actually asked them to open another tab, follow the steps that they learned so far, access databases, find an article, email it to themselves, email it to me, and then check back into the activity to let me know if they were successful. So by the time I get to the end of looking at their feedback, I know how many students in my class have effectively and successfully gotten in and done a database research and how many haven't. And I will tell you that since moving to this guided thinking activity in online class, every single student that I've had in the last, I think, 7 years that Eric and I have been doing this has successfully been able to access and gain research through the databases just from this activity.
So I will just also reiterate, we don't get to lecture in our online class, but there is still content being transmitted. We're just we're offloading what we used to do in lecture, which frees us up to be learner facilitators. And so I don't really feel like we've lost anything. And let me ask you this, Carrie. When you teach a face-to-face class, would you take your students to the library, or would you actually invite them or make them go online and do what is really an online learning assignment? I mean, would you use this in a face-to-face class?
I do. I absolutely do. And so ever since I was forced to move our learning community to the online platform, it kind of forced me to be creative about how can I have students meet the same outcomes or goals without the same tools or resources available. So I came up with this. As I've already pointed out, it works so much better than what I used to do in my face-to-face class. So yes, Eric, you hit the nail on the head. This is exactly what I no longer take my students to the library. There's no need. They get into our class, even the residential sections, and they do this kind of a guided thinking activity, and it works great for them as well.
So Carrie, I'm just thinking that also frees up that day that you would have taken your students to the library. They're doing this on their own for homework or pre-work, which frees up that face-to-face class that you have to do something different. You don't have to cover this content. You can do something value added on that day and actually help your students learn more. So if I'm reflecting all the way back to our best class ever, why did our students learn so much? They were doing more work and we had more time to be learner facilitators. So it probably shouldn't surprise us that our students actually did better.
Well, I will point out though as well that everybody right now is in this place where you're stretching yourselves to learn and create materials online that you did not expect to have to create. And so it's hard to feel like you're freeing up any time for yourself to be a learner facilitator when you are actually in the position of designing the course. When you are playing that heavy duty role as instructional designer and you're just trying to get the activities prepared and ready for students, it's really hard to have time available to step into the learner facilitator role. So you may find that you are working really hard right now to be an instructional designer, to be creating these kinds of learning experiences for students. And that may leave you with very little energy to be a learner facilitator. That's okay. The more and more that you design these, like Eric said, you have the resources created and then it frees you up. I don't spend time lecturing to my students anymore. I give them the activities that I created and then I get to fully embrace that position as a learner facilitator and help them as they're learning and working with those activities.
So I will only quickly point out that your LMS, if it's Desire to Learn or Canvas or whatever, also has a discussion tool with many uses. We definitely are getting students into the discussion tool. This is a really typical kind of discussion where students are invited or asked to make a original post, and it's really a short essay. There are particular learning outcomes that we're assessing here, and then students do a reply, which has a separate set of outcomes. And again, this is students doing the work, which lets us sit back, watch the students doing this work, and then we can go in on the back end, see how well did students do, how well did they grasp the concepts, and then we can give either individual feedback or feedback to the whole class. And so just to let you know, some examples, we thought you might appreciate some actual examples of how online tools can be used to do active learning strategies.
And so this just about wraps up our second video section here. So we really just want to summarize for you what we've shared with you in this video. And these are the 3 moves that we would suggest making if you're thinking about transforming from that traditional knowledge transmission teacher type into the more dynamic instructional designer, experience designer, learning facilitator. You need to start by defining your essentials, which a lot of you are already doing because of this crisis we're dealing with. You're clarifying your outcomes. You're figuring out how the outcomes are different from just the content of the course. And you're starting to think about what is it that students need to learn or practice in order to get at these outcomes. You're hopefully designing summative assessments that make sense. Whatever those important essentials are, they need to be captured by and communicated in this summative assessment. The summative assessment should tightly match up with whatever those essentials are. You should be testing or measuring or allowing students to showcase whatever it is that gets them at those outcomes that you want them to achieve. And then you need to design backwards from those summative assessments. So you are really thinking very intentionally about where do my students what do my students need to practice? Where can they do it in the tools that I have available? And where are those intervention points where I'm going to provide feedback? We can't provide feedback on every single thing that students are producing in an online class. That's just an enormous amount of work. But what are those key points of intervention? Where are those places where we could give the most meaningful feedback that has the biggest return on investment? So finding those places and then just really working as a learner facilitator to give students the kind of feedback that will put them on track for being successful with those summative assessments.
And so this is the end of video 2. Video 3, which you can finish this video, take a break, come back and watch the last video about the future. But I will say what we would invite you to do now is any questions, comments that you have about video 2, once you stop the video, go and add those comments before you move on to video number 3.